This Bill of Rights will be all about. CTV's Avery McRae reports. In her 10 years of renting, Nikki Kennedy.
Okay, you're being recorded. You might have to fool around with this now.
Let me just see what's going on here. Huh? Well, you know what? I'm gonna go back behind here.
Right, just make sure that you get like you're showing on the screen.
Yeah, right
Now,
next to her.
okay, so I'm gonna have just. Okay, so I'll just. Okay, welcome. Welcome, everybody. We are going to start in a minute.
Okay.
Just you're being recorded. So.
Oh, there it goes. Yeah, I think it's working.
Okay. Let's give it another minute or two.
Hey. Well, you know what? I'm just gonna go get myself a glass of
I just want to welcome everybody. We're going to start in a minute. Again, this is part three of the lecture of Whose Promised Land with Angus Smith. And if we can have your attention, we're going to start. Angus, you're up. I am not going to introduce Angus. You don't need an introduction once you hear his lecture.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming on this not very nice night. I hope that nobody had to drive too far because I know it's very foggy outside of the city. So anyway, but please be careful when you go home. And I will have to leave fairly promptly when we're done because I've got to get back to the South Shore through that fog, and I think it's going to take me a while. So anyway, but thank you for coming. And this is the last class. So today we're gonna go from the 48, the War of Independence in 1948, 49, and up until more or less the present day. But I'm going to take a couple of digressions, and one is based on a question that was asked last week, and I decided it was about the whole question of the Mufti and Palestinians, sort of the Mufti's relationship with Nazi Germany. And so I want to kind of explore that a little bit. And then at the end, I want to explore Hamas a little bit more and sort of what Hamas is and what its origins are. So anyway, so yes, last week we ended with independence, and we know that that in May the 14th, 1948, Israel, based on the UN, a UN vote, declared its independence, and almost immediately, the Arab nations declared war on Israel, or a variety of Arab nations. And why? So there was a consensus in the sort of the Arab League, which we'll talk about in a minute, that a Jewish state, however it was partitioned between Arabs and Jews, was essentially another form of European and American colonialism under another name, and that it was also an outcome of guilt, I guess, on the part of, or one of the, at least partly an outcome of guilt on the part of Western nations over either engineering and carrying out the Holocaust, or turning a blind eye to it. And and that ultimately the state of Israel was an unacceptable resolution to decades of Zionist and Arab conflict. And so again, within hours of the proclamation, literally within hours, the nascent state of Israel was at war, and it was attacked by armies from, I thought I brought a bottle of water over here. Did anybody see it? What? Sorry? Oh, I didn't even take it with me. I know, Jacob, I stepped out of camera range there. So it was attacked by armies from Egypt, armies of Egypt, Transjordan, now known as Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, and as well as this kind of foreign legion, I suppose, that was funded by the Arab League, and also various Palestinian Arab irregulars. Hi, Marty. And all of the countries, all of the aforementioned countries, were members of the League of Arab States, which came to be known as the Arab League and is still known as the Arab League. It was founded in 1945 as a response, I suppose, to concerns about post-war colonial divisions of territory in the whole region, as well as very strong opposition to the emergence of a Jewish state on what it viewed as Palestinian Arab territory. And ideally, it was a kind of an Arab, an Arab UN, right? I mean, that was sort of the vision of at least some of the founders of the Arab League, but it's, long been criticized quite justly for disunity, for poor governance, and critics have always said that it's traditionally the Arab League has traditionally been more representative of its various autocratic regimes than it has of the actual Arab citizens of those regimes or of the Arab people writ large. So from the point of view of the Arab League, skipping ahead about a year, the war, the 48-49 war was a humiliating disaster. So despite all of these founding principles of the Arab League, the war really wasn't about Palestinian Arabs. And I think that this is a pattern that we're going to see kind of sort of repeating itself over and over and over again as we move through the post-war period and up to the present day. So it wasn't really about Palestinian Arabs. For example, the Egyptian leader, King Farouk, there was still a king ruling Egypt at the time, became involved in this war because he was afraid of the growing influence of the kings of Transjordan and Iraq in the region. Syria, for its part, really was interested in getting the Arab part of Palestine and absorbing it into Greater Syria. And Abdullah, who was the king of Transjordan at the time, also wanted the Arab portion of Palestine, especially the city of Jerusalem, which under the UN partition plan was the old city was intended to be what was called a corpus separatum, that would be under kind of international rule. And by contrast to this kind of disorganized and quite honestly sort of self-interested allegiance of Arab states, Israel, and particularly the Haganah and other pre-existing self-defense groups, which by this time had amalgamated as the IDF, had experience facing down a sophisticated, well-trained European army and police force in the form of the British Army and the Palestine police. And in contrast to the Arab belligerents, the Israelis had a unified command and control they had access to a fairly well-developed arms smuggling network. And of course, ultimately, the determination that comes with fighting with your back to a wall, right? For the Arab League, the war was political. The 48-49 war was political. For the nascent state of Israel, it was existential. It was about survival or death, one or the other. Nevertheless, out of a little over about 600,000 Jewish citizens at the time, Israel lost 6,000 people in this war. That's 1% of the population. And if you put that in Canadian terms, that's like losing 400,000 Canadians over a 9-month period. These are losses on a staggering scale. So King Abdullah in Jordan got his wish. There was the peace agreement granted Jordan control over what we now call the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Temple Mount, which had religious significance for the Arabs. Gaza ended up in Egyptian hands, but Israel, meanwhile, consolidated its control over Arab areas. Sorry, we're just gonna, did it turn? Yes, there it is. Okay, so that's the original partition plan. And that is what it looked like. Sorry, no, going the wrong way there. And that's what Israel looked like at the end of the 48 war. After the armistice, more than 60% of Israel's total land area had been formally designated as kind of the Arab state, and an estimated 750,000 to 850,000 Palestinians had been displaced. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I think for the new state of Israel, victory so soon after independence was an affirmation not only of the Zionist dream. Sorry, I have to keep looking there to make sure I've got the right picture. But of the far, far more ancient yearning, which I think has been certainly a leitmotif in what we've been talking about over the past few weeks, of the far more ancient yearning for return to the ancestral home, for return to the indigenous home, if you will, that, as we know, has been promised to us by Hashem. And that is certainly expressed in our national anthem, the Hatikva. Our hope is 2,000 years old, to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. And, you know, from a Jewish perspective, this is, you know, one of the most truly monumental achievements and one of the most truly monumental events in our entire history. And for Israelis, the independence and ultimate victory in the 48 war was a formative event. It represented justice and redemption for the Jewish people after centuries of exile and persecution. Israel was the very antithesis of Galut. It was the very antithesis of exile among the nations, and what was even to many Israelis in those days, the very debased existence of the diaspora. But there's kind of another side to this, right? And again, this course is really about narratives, and I'm not really trying to pass value judgments. But for Palestinian Arabs, it was the end. Again, it was existential. And the war and independence and the outcome of the war is referred to in Arabic by a term that many of you know, which is Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. And so Palestine, right, from an Arab perspective, as I guess parallel Palestine as Arab space, real or imagined, no longer existed. It was now it was a Jewish state called Israel. And as above, up to 850,000 Arabs, about half the Arabs of Mandate Palestine, living inside the new state of Israel, or what had become the new state of Israel, became refugees. In their perception, essentially a community destroyed. And I think how this process unfolded, like so much else, not only in the Levant, but right across the Middle East, is kind of recounted in a lot of conflicting narratives. And historically, one narrative is that most of the refugees, most of the Arabs that fled the new state of Israel were either panicked by anti-Israeli propaganda that was being propagated by the Arab League and by the various armies, or they were told that they should leave by the attacking Arab nations, and then they would be free to return once the Arab armies kind of achieved this sort of inevitable victory. However, we also know that from the historical record, there was no official Israeli policy of Arab expulsion, right? That did not exist. People talked about it, but there was no official policy of Arab expulsion. But unofficially, right up to people like David Ben-Gurion, it was seen as the only effective way of securing the Jewish state through demographics, right? And I mean, the whole demographic problem is one that we still face today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So some Arabs were indeed driven out. Some Arabs were so terrorized that they fled. Some of them indeed were panicked by that anti-Israeli propaganda. Some of them believed what they were being told by their Arab brothers and sisters in the Arab League. But a major part of the Arab narrative, for example, is hang on. Oh, yes, that's not, but sorry, I'm always behind with my pictures, So a major part of the Arab narrative, for example, is the Deir Yassin massacre, which actually took place just before statehood. And what happened, according to a number of very reputable Israeli historians now who've had access to contemporary records, and Benny Morris is very interesting on this, is that Israeli Irgun and Lahi irregulars attacked a small village outside of Jerusalem, and 254 men, women, and children were murdered. And there were allegations of sexual violence as well, although it's interesting that given current events, given what happened in October, it's very important to note that in subsequent conflicts, accusations of sexual violence have almost never been leveled against Israeli troops. Then what happened was that a few days later, a convoy of medical Jewish Israeli medical and academic staff who were en route through occupied territory to the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus were attacked by Arab irregulars. And yes. And the convoy was machine gunned. As you can see, this is a picture of the aftermath. Trucks and buses carrying the physicians, the nurses, the academics were set on fire with people still inside. And at the end of it all, 78 Israelis and 1 British soldier had been killed, and dozens of them were actually burned beyond recognition. So this became part of this sort of perpetual back and forth with Israelis accusing Arabs, often with great justification, of murdering Jewish women and children in terrorist attacks on kibbutzim and isolated villages. And one thing that is rarely mentioned, certainly not in Arab narratives of the Deir Yassin massacre, is that Deir Yassin, the village, was being used as a sniper nest to fire on West Jerusalem. And then on the other hand, you've got Arabs accusing Israelis of what we would now call ethnic cleansing. And again, echoes of this resound over and over and over again and continue to resound, more than 75 years later. So subsequently, most Palestinian refugees, people who'd actually fled the boundaries of the state of Israel, came under UN administration, specifically the UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Works Administration. And they were put into UNRWA camps. They ended up in UNRWA camps in Jordan, Syria, Gaza, Lebanon. And, this remains extremely contentious to this day, because as we know, refugee camps are meant to be temporary. But now we've got 3 and 4 generations of people living in these camps, because the UNRWA definition of a Palestinian refugee is multi-generational, and they are less camps than they are kind of sprawling slums on the margins of cities in Lebanon and Syria and the West Bank. And these people have never been repatriated. They've never been resettled. Obviously, this is a huge political issue, which we'll talk about a little later. And there's only one Arab country, Jordan, that is prepared to offer them citizenship. In most countries like Syria and Lebanon, they have no civil rights whatsoever. And they remain to this day pawns in a protracted political game in which they have very little say. So for Arabs and Palestinians, this whole idea of Nakba has become a sort of all-purpose designator for the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think it's also important to understand the tremendous impact of these events of the late 40s and the early 50s as Israel consolidated itself as a state. Remember, this is one of the youngest countries in the world that is constantly in a state of kind of self-creation, right? And we know, and part of the Arab narrative, the Palestinian narrative, is that as an outcome of the 48-49 war, Arab-owned businesses collapsed as their owners fled. And just as importantly, there was this kind of disappearance or evaporation of an Arab middle class and intelligentsia, and that ordinary Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, were kind of left helpless and leaderless. But few people, and certainly few people outside of the Jewish world, know the other side of this story, right? There's a whole other side of this story, because at the time of statehood and continuing into the 60s and 70s, about 875,000 Jews, so almost the same number of Jews as Palestinians who were expelled, ran, fled, whatever from Israel, living in the Middle East and North Africa, were also forced from their homes, and they were rendered stateless by hostile Arab regimes, usually leaving in nothing but the clothes they stood up in. Not always, but usually. And I mean, certainly I remember, and probably many of us in this room remember, I grew up in Toronto, and I remember suddenly that every year, every September in school, there'd be this because I lived in Forest Hill, I lived in a Jewish neighborhood, there'd sort of be this influx of kids from places like Morocco and Iraq. And they were the sort of the scatterlings of these Jewish communities in the Arab world. And so this too, right? This too represented the complete destruction of very ancient communities, right? Some of which went back to the Babylonian captivity 2,600 years ago. And so the loss to the world of Jewish scholarship and of a unique way of life that had a huge influence on both Jewish and global culture is incalculable. And it also changed Israel, right? Because in 1948, 75% of Israeli Jews were European or Ashkenazi Jews. By 1961, only 55% of Israelis were Ashkenazi, and the rest were Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and the Middle East. And that's, of course, to say nothing of these tremendous influxes of other Jews through the 1970s, like Ethiopians. And there's always tension. There's always tension between the two groups. And historically, if there was a Jewish underclass in Israel, certainly, again, historically, it was Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews who were often deeply resentful of what they called Yechs, the German Jews, who they say retain a sense of proprietorship over the state that they believe they invented. And if you're interested in this, there's a great new book. I just got it. I'm going to review it for the Jewish Book Council. It's called Israel's Black Panthers. And it was just published by Asaf Elia Shalev by the University of California Press. And it's a really fascinating account of kind of sorry, I just lost a word. I'm getting old, but just the sort of the movement of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews in Israel, especially in the 60s and 70s, and the way that they were inspired by groups like the Black Panthers in the United States. And it's definitely worth a read, especially when it comes out in paperback. And I'll send you all my review from the Jewish Book Council when I'm done. So you've got this, again, I'm saying this because you've got this perpetual problem. You've got this perpetual problem post-1948 of kind of dueling narratives. You know, you've got these dueling expulsions, you've got dueling mythologies, and it's very, very, very difficult to resolve. So by the 1950s, and this is a couple of interesting historical photographs of Jews. These are Yemeni Jews on the left. That's part of Operation Magic Carpet in the early 1950s. And then these are Iraqi Jews in a settlement camp in the desert a little bit later. So by the 1950s, Palestinian resistance outside of Israel was growing steadily. And this is outside of Israel. So countries surrounding Israel, again, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, provided bases for and encouraged more or less constant raids, low-level military-style incursion into Israel by Palestinian fighters, terrorists, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, that's right, the Fedayeen. And so one group in particular, Fatah, and it's also probably important to note that there's a real whole Cold War angle to this, encouraged, and that because a lot of this, of course, was being encouraged and supported by the Soviet Union and Syria, a power broker in the region, and which then, as now, was the main Soviet, now Russian proxy in the region. And one group in particular, Fatah, which is an Arabic acronym for Palestine National Liberation Movement, and also an Arabic root word for victory, was founded in the 1950s by Yasser Arafat, other young Palestinian radicals, activists, terrorists, freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them, Fedayeen. And they were conducting the bulk of raids into Israel and attracting, they were kind of like a black hole. They're sort of attracting all of these other extremist Palestinian groups into their orbit. And in 1964, kind of fearing that the situation was starting to get out of control, the Arab League combined a whole lot of these groups, including Arafat's Fatah, into the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. Didn't solve the problem. And then in May of 1967, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who had deposed the leader of Egypt, King Farouk, in a military coup in 1952. We okay here?
Yeah, just keep going.
Decided that it was time to finish the job begun by the first Arab-Israel War in 1948. So he expelled UN peacekeepers from Sinai, blockaded Israel, and massed Egyptian troops along the Israeli border so that war became inevitable. And Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq attacked Israel in June of 1967. And by the time the UN brokered a ceasefire 6 days later, hence the name, 6 Days War, Israel was not only still there, it had also occupied Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Temple Mount, and Syria's Golan Heights. So that sort of shows you the territory that they gained. And this is an interesting old map that actually shows the division of Jerusalem. And this is prior to the '67 war. And you can see that This side, including the old city, was Jordan. This side was Israel, and there was only one crossing that was very difficult, called the Mandelbaum Gate, which was sort of up towards the top of the line there. And so the 67 war, I'm just gonna go ahead here. Sorry, I just need to move this down. Oh, that's not what I want you to see. Ah, there we go. Oh, that was mixed up. This is what I wanted you to see. No, that's not what I want you to see.
Your slides are not showing on the screen. We see your entire computer screen, but not the individual slides.
I don't know. Huh. Sorry, we've had a bit of a technical problem here.
I think he just has to double click.
Zoom slideshow. All right, let's try this. There we go. That's the picture I wanted you to see, the iconic photograph. So the 67 war was another rout, right, for the combined Arab armies. And almost immediately after the defeat of the Six-Day War, Nasser and the other leaders, Arab leaders, began plotting an all-out war. 1973, Egypt led a second attack on Israel, this time catching it unprepared in the midst of the high holidays, as we know, hence the Yom Kippur War, and I think hence the very traumatic association for Jews between the events, for Israelis, for all of us, for the between the events of 1973 and the events of October of 2023, which also came at the very end of the high holy days. And that may have been a deliberate choice on the part of Hamas. We still don't know that. But while Israel eventually regained the initiative, Egypt cannot be said to have won the 1973 war. But what's very interesting is that if you're a foreign diplomat or foreign official of any kind in Egypt, you're inevitably taken to the Egyptian Military Museum, which features this huge kind of cyclorama. It's built around a cyclorama depicting the Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War, as they call it. And it's very difficult to tell from looking at this cyclorama that Egypt actually lost the war, because what you see is this sort of, all these craven Israelis in being defeated in various humiliating ways. But I think the early successes, and this was I think a bit of a sea change in Israel. The early successes of the Arab armies in the 73 war demonstrated to Jews, to Israelis, but also to Arabs that Israel was not necessarily invincible. And I think that's a lesson that certainly many Arab groups kind of took to heart. So why is this important? Well, I think that with some encouragement from the Soviet Union, again, there's a whole Cold War angle to this. What all of this meant was that increasingly the Arab-Israeli conflict was being framed in the context of anti-colonialism, anti-American, and anti-capitalist movements all over the world. And now we can look at Che. And as some Arab countries were kind of being gathered into the Soviet, perhaps not the Soviet, but the non-aligned orbit, Israel became increasingly dependent upon the United States for political and military support. And in a post-war world that was dominated, and a Cold War world in which was dominated by two superpowers, the battle lines were very clear. And remember, this was a time of massive political ferment. There were anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States and Europe, and they were also very much in that kind of anti-colonialist, anti-US imperialist context. And so when we think of what we think of, as sort of a contemporary manifestation of global woke culture that's driving a lot of what we see in terms of the protest, even right here in Halifax, not just Halifax, Bridgewater. There are free Palestine protests in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, almost every weekend. And we think of it as this kind of manifestation of global woke culture, right? And sort of the complete madness of progressive movements all over the world. But this is something that's actually been going on for half a century, right? And so almost overnight, especially in the aftermath of the 73 war, Israel was kind of transformed in the eyes of progressives all over the world from this kind of plucky little David that was holding off the Goliath into this cruel and despotic giant in its own right that was kind of grinding the faces of Palestinians. Again, 50 years of this, and it becomes very corrosive, it becomes very toxic. And the problem here is that unlike a lot of other manifestations of anti-colonial protest, anti-colonialist activism, anti-Israel sentiment was and is often couched, as we know, in racial and annihilationist terms, and sometimes both. So the PLO Charter, the Charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, says Zionism, racist and fanatic in its nature, aggressive, expansionist, and colonial in its aims, and fascist in its methods. Israel is a geographical base for world imperialism. The liberation of Palestine will destroy the Zionist and imperialist presence and will contribute to the establishment of peace in the Middle East. Goes on to say, claims of historical or religious ties of Jews with Palestine are incompatible with the facts of history. And Judaism, being a religion, is not an independent nationality, and nor do Jews constitute a single nation with an identity of its own. They are citizens of the states to which they belong, like, Poland. So, linking Zionism to racism and imperialism, and I think this is important because there's very much, the roots of contemporary, the roots of contemporary conflict, I think, have been manifest throughout, our talks here over the past few weeks. But I think it's really, really important to understand this, that linking Zionism to racism, not even Zionism, linking Israel to racism, linking Jews to racism and imperialism and even fascism, sometimes Nazism, had a powerful impact on a world, particularly a post-colonial world, because again, we're talking about the 1960s here, that was still coming to terms with the meaning and the consequences of racism and imperialism. And emerging nations and their advocates and their supporters were increasingly convinced that Zionist organizations and Zionist capital dominated the planet. So we're starting to see the reemergence of all of these kind of old conspiracy, these old tropes that we thought had died with the Second World War, that they were sort of invisible power, inextricably linked to American imperialism, and perhaps, in fact, even the driver of American imperialism. And this culminated in United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379 that was adopted on the 10th of November, 1975 by a vote of 72 to 35 with 32 abstentions. And it was passed mainly by the Soviet bloc, by the Arab League, and unaligned nations. And this resolution determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, an imperialistic militant ideology of racial hatred, which should be universally condemned. And again, the overall effect was turning the Zionist enterprise and the very existence of Israel, quite apart from the implicit racism, perhaps even annihilationism, but turning all of this into kind of a north-south issue, right? And this is where I want to digress a bit, because I want to talk about something that was raised last week, and several people here noticed me skip over a picture. And the picture that I skipped over was this one. So what's interesting, and this is a particular fascination to me, the near constant conflation
Still not seeing your screen.
Israel and Zionism with fascism and even Nazism has given rise to a really long-standing debate in Israel about the links between Palestinian nationalism and Nazi ideology. So a little bit of historical background. In the Second World War, the Middle East and North Africa were critical to Nazi grand strategy. And in the words of one historian, victories in the Near East in their strategic and economic value would surpass conquests in southern Russia. And I'm sorry, that isn't from a historian. That's a quote from Erwin Rommel, General Rommel, who led the Africa Corps, who basically led the German assault across North Africa. And with the Middle East secure, think about this. With the Middle East secure, Germany, remember how absolutely critical, we've talked about this several times over the past few weeks, how absolutely critical the Levant and the rest of the Middle East is as a kind of an entry point to Asia and to the Caucasus. So Germany would control the Suez Canal and the oil fields of Persia and Iraq and the Caucasus. And German access to Asia would be secure in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Western Indian Ocean would essentially be German lakes. So potentially, these are catastrophic outcomes, right? Not only for the world, but also for the Jews of the Middle East and the nascent state of Israel. So by the time the war broke out, Arab nationalism was fully ablaze, and we talked about that last week. And it was set alight by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the artificial divisions that were imposed on the Middle East by the Versailles Treaty of 1919. And the Nazis, who were also midwifed by Versailles, understood that nationalism. And they worked hard to manipulate it, although with varying degrees of success, even by their own reckoning. And it all kind of coalesced to one degree or another on this character called Haj Amin el-Husseini. And this is him here, and that's him with an SS, Bosnian SS division on the left-hand side? Yes, left-hand side.
Excuse me.
And he was the British-appointed Mufti of Jerusalem, and he fled Palestine for Berlin via Iraq at the outbreak of war with a British arrest warrant for sedition kind of hanging over his head. And he's often been portrayed as a sort of a central figure in Nazi grand strategy in the Middle East and also in the post-war development of Palestinian nationalist ideology. And as I say, this is a huge debate in Israel right now. And in a 1941 conversation with Hitler, and interesting, this was his sole meeting with Hitler, and this is it right here, and it was recorded by Hitler's private secretary. Husseini said the Arabs are Germany's natural friends because they have the same enemies as Germany, namely the English, the Jews, and the communists, right? So yes, Husseini was an arch anti-Semite. And he probably visited some model concentration camps like Sachsenhausen, which started out as a model concentration camp, sort of to show the world that these were actually kind of, health resorts. And although there are claims that he visited Auschwitz, these remain unconfirmed. Nobody can either really sort of prove them or disprove them. And given what the Nazis were doing, I think that the suggestions that have been made that Husseini was actually the architect of the final solution are actually pretty far-fetched. And the American-Israeli historian Gershon Gorenberg suggests that al-Husseini was actually relatively marginal. Certainly the Nazis recognized his value as a propagandist and a rabble-rouser. They put him on the radio. He was a kind of Arabic language Ezra Pound and encouraged him to help raise a Muslim SS division, which you can see there. But they made no promises to al-Husseini beyond pledging to kill the Jews of Palestine, which they planned to do anyway, which was part of their grand strategy, Husseini or otherwise. And more importantly, as as Hitler's private secretary noted, they had no confidence in Husseini's claim that the Arab world was soaked in inflammable pro-Axis emotion. And so the real problem, I think, is that even some of the most fervent Arab nationalists realized that there was fundamental conflict between their aspirations and what the Nazis had planned for them. And basically, an Axis victory would mean trading British domination for either German or Italian rule, and all that entailed. So,
Excuse me.
and it's kind of interesting the way this played out as the war progressed. So while al-Husseini, who was safe in Berlin, congratulated the Italians for a series of devastating air raids on Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and Haifa in 40 and 41, the fervently anti-Zionist newspaper, Philistine, roundly condemned the criminal bombardment, and Arabs as well as Jews raised funds for the British war effort. And when the Jewish Agency began urging young Palestinian Jews to enlist in the British Army, Arab organizations were doing the same thing. And we know that about 12,000 Palestinian Arabs wore British uniforms during the war. Virtually all of the Free French forces fighting in North Africa were actually North African Arabs, and they actually took the heaviest casualties of any French forces in the war. But we also know that about 130,000 young Palestinian Jews also ended up in British uniforms. Nevertheless, there was Arab ambivalence, and in the aftermath of the Allied defeat of the Nazis at El Alamein in 1942, a rearguard attempt by the SS to recruit Arab collaborators to foment rebellion and murder the Jews of Allied-held Morocco and Algeria came, in the words of Gershon Gorenberg, to nothing. So they kind of gave a pogrom and nobody came. So the degree to which Nazi ideology actually influenced Palestinian nationalism remains kind of debatable. And certainly it seems to owe as much to post-imperial, post-colonial ideology as above. Witness the strong Palestinian connection through the 60s and 70s with the European far left, and also to post-war Islamist thinking, which I'm going to discuss below.
Excuse me, is there any? Excuse me.
Apart from this, the Six-Day and Yom Kippur Wars, so that's my digression, but completely changed the rhythm of violent confrontation between Israel and Palestinians and the rest of the Middle East. Because those two wars were the last time that the Arab world, right, the Arab world as a unity would kind of physically confront Israel in conventional ground combat, right? So I'm not talking about Hamas, I'm not talking about Hezbollah, I'm not talking about PLO, I'm talking about Arab states as a unity. So for Palestinians living in the West Bank, in Gaza, in refugee camps, in Lebanon and Syria, this kind of withdrawal of Arab nations, seemingly almost with their tails between their legs from the field of battle, was devastating, right? Because it was a complete reversal of all of the propaganda about the solidarity among the Arab people that had sort of been the foundation of the Arab League narrative. And some particular blows, sort of moving through the 1970s, to Palestinians were the Camp David Accords of 1979, in which the Carter administration brokered a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. If anybody's seen the movie Golda, that's certainly a major plot point in that movie. And it kind of resulted in a cold peace. I mean, Egypt is not a great friend of Israel, but a peace nonetheless. And it would ultimately result in the very public and brutal assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat by Islamist extremist army officers in 1981, and was in fact a major factor in the early development of Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, the other blow was the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty of 1994, which had been a de facto reality since the 1990s or since the 1980s. And for the huge Palestinian population living in the West Bank, it kind of eliminated any the possibility of reincorporation of the region into Greater Jordan. And increasingly, the armed struggle for the liberation of Palestine became the purview of groups that primarily used terrorist tactics against Israeli civilians, especially the Palestine Liberation Organization, its offshoots, affiliates, and component parts. And so that meant that through the 1970s, especially, there was a devastating series of terrorist attacks, some of which I'm sure, most of which we all remember from the time the Avavim school bus massacre, in which 9 Israeli children were killed and 19 were crippled. The Munich massacre, subject of a recent Steven Spielberg film. The Ma'alot school massacre, killed and wounded almost 100 children. The Coastal Road massacre that killed 37 people. The list goes on and on and on and on. So we see the emergence of this truly toxic dynamic. And on one side, you've got 1 million Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza who are kind of chafing under Israeli occupation, which for them means that they are essentially stateless from their point of view. They are stateless people governed by, from their point of view, a foreign power, and few, if any, opportunities for self-determination or self-governance. And they've seemingly been abandoned, not just seemingly, they have been abandoned in large measure by wealthy Arab states and multilateral organizations, in a pattern that would continue up until the present day. And so Israel has these moments of unutterable tragedy. We talked about Mount Scopus, Munich. We talked about October, and we know October the 7th, 2023. But so do Palestinians. I mean, there's an enormous amount of sort of martyrology in the Palestinian narrative, and these are indubitably terrible things. They're awful things that happened to people. How many people here remember the 1982 massacre at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp just outside of Beirut? So during the Lebanese Civil War, Israel invaded southern Lebanon, as it has subsequently, in an effort to root out PLO strongholds. Now it's often about Hezbollah strongholds, in alliance with the South Lebanon Army, which was a far-right Christian militia and an Israeli, at that time, a kind of Israeli proxy in the region. And in September '82, following the assassination of Lebanese President Bashir Gemayel, IDF troops under the authority of then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon allowed South Lebanon Army troops into the Sabra and Shatila camp to mop up PLO fighters. And most of the victims of Sabra and Shatila were refugees, including a disproportionate number of women and children, and estimates of the total dead on those 2 days and 1 night range from 1,500 to 3,500 people. Obviously, this did not involve the IDF. There were no IDF troops on the ground in Sabra and Shatila, but the Palestinian narrative blames Israel for kind of unleashing its proxies. And on the other side of this calculus, we have to remember that in the mid-1970s, Israel was still, is now, but was then a tiny country. It had a population under 4 million people. That included Israeli Arabs, and importantly, a significant plurality of Holocaust survivors and Jewish expellees from Arab states. So these are people whose lived experience was shaped by the reality of an existential threat to the Jewish people. So the state had survived 2 major wars, to say nothing of almost daily incursions and attacks by Arab fighters, both along the borders with neighboring states and inside cities and towns. They're confronted by an antagonist that is not only prepared to target civilians, but in many respects seems only to target civilians, and is completely dedicated not just to the establishment of a Palestinian state, but to the elimination of your state, our state, and apparently of everybody in it, based on, in modern terms, a complete denial of Jewish indigeneity. And that's an ideology that is supported and widecast by progressives and by the world's most important multilateral group, the United Nations. Remember the UN resolution of 1975, which you're a member, which Israel is a member, often supported by a narrative that draws on the very anti-Semitic eliminationist tropes that underlay the Holocaust and European pogrom culture. And another problem, is there a red line on that? No. Another problem with roots in the 67 and 73 wars and their aftermath is the so-called settler movement. And this is a picture of Hanan Porat leading the first contingent of what we would now call settlers into Sebastia in the West Bank, I believe in 1976. And so the capture of the West Bank and East Jerusalem would essentially restored the historical lands of Judea and Samaria. And even that terminology would become highly politically fraught, at least in the minds of many religiously and politically conservative Israelis. And beginning almost as soon as the 67 war was over, Israeli settlers started moving into East Jerusalem, parts of which, especially the Old City, were actually annexed directly as part of Israel. And the settlements, as we can see here, gained real momentum after the 73 war, moving into the West Bank proper. And it was partly about Israeli state sovereignty, partly about establishing a Jewish presence in the midst of in as much of historical Israel as possible. And remember, we're talking about a movement that's made up of significant numbers of very religious people, or people with a very broad historical Zionist vision. Now, I think there are a couple of important points here. Allowing settlers in occupied territories is illegal under Article 49 of the Geneva Convention, which Israel ratified in 1951. And it is interpreted, and legions of lawyers have kind of devoted lives to this. It's often interpreted as a war crime. But there is a double standard at work here, because certainly the settler movement in Judea and Samaria is not the only one in the world. Morocco allows settlers into Western Sahara, which it has occupied for years. And similarly, there's an exchange of settlers between the Turkish and Greek sectors of Cyprus. And, nobody seems to get too worried about that. But nevertheless, what Palestinians see is that Israeli settlers in the West Bank have full Israeli civil rights. There's modern infrastructure, roads, telecoms, water, electricity, and protection of IDF for settlements, and even, often for what are called outposts. And there's a network of roads that's been built that's designed to facilitate, or seems to be designed to facilitate, Israeli movement between settlements and Israel proper. And many of these roads cut Palestinian villages in half, separate farmers from their fields and grazing lands. And so there's a tremendous amount of conflict, as we know. And we know that settler-Palestinian conflict includes everything from physical confrontation and mob violence on both sides, to shootings, bombings, to deliberate destruction of fields, olive and fruit groves, homes, animal herds, etc. And this has led, I think this has led to another one of the most common tropes in current circulation about Israel and about Israelis, which is that Israel is an apartheid state. So this isn't as clear-cut as it seems. First of all, Arab citizens of Israel have full civil rights, right? And there's often a gap between the theory and the practice of civil rights, right? Just ask any Canadian Aboriginal or any African American about that. But Arab Israelis, as we know, are represented by their own parties in the Knesset. They sit on the Israeli bench. They can be found in the senior ranks of the civil service, business, finance, the police, the army, and so on. On the other hand, the occupied territories are a bit of a different story. They exist in a kind of a legal limbo. So it can be characterized as a form of apartheid, but it's complicated. And believe me, and I mean, many of you who've traveled in the West Bank, I've traveled in the West Bank, it really doesn't look a whole lot like South Africa in the 70s and 80s. The settlement enterprise might be illegal, but an Israeli jurist would say, and again, this forms a very strong part of the Israeli narrative, would say that as occupied rather than Israeli territory, Israel's priority has to be the protection of its own borders and of its own people. So does that make it a settler colonialist state? Does that make it an apartheid state? And discuss that amongst yourselves. So I think that the tendency to understand the Israel and Palestine conflict there's a tendency to understand this conflict in purely Manichaean terms, right? The sort of the conflict between good and evil. And certainly that's how many on both sides want it to be understood. But it's important to remember the diversity of Israeli society. Excuse me just for a second here while I fool with this. And this is just kind of a random street photograph. Oh, you know what? Sorry. No? So it's important, and most of us probably have been to Israel. We know how incredibly diverse a society it is. It includes Arabs, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Arabs and Jews, Muslims and Jews, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews, and there have always been extremely complex relationships between all of these groups. And historically, intermarriage is not uncommon. And there are historically friendships, business relationships across these lines of diversity, these cultural lines have existed. And there have always been close ties, between Jewish and Arab civilizations, as we've discussed. And in Israel, as we've seen, the two have lived together on the same land for millennia. And in many respects, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews have much more in common with their Arab neighbors than they do with the Ashkenazi ruling class, which is how they see it, right? Because there is that narrative as well. So the tremendous cost, I think, of this conflict to both sides encouraged or has encouraged at various times in its history some serious attempts to address them. To resolve them, to address violence, and even to move towards some form of Palestinian statehood. So one of the driving forces here was between 1987 and 1993, Palestinian uprising that became known as the First Intifada. And it literally means in Arabic a sort of a uprising. It literally means a shaking off. And it began as a manifestation of Palestinian frustration with the occupation that began in '67, continuing humiliations of life in the West Bank and Gaza, and perceived Israeli unwillingness to implement or consider any form of meaningful resolution. And while the PLO was involved in the first Intifada, as well as a nascent Hamas, because this is around the time that Hamas started coming on the scene, it was in many respects a kind of a grassroots uprising, and so this is why so much of the Intifada, and especially if you happen to be there at the time and witness some of it, it was these kind of pitched battles in the streets with stones and slingshots. It was very reminiscent, actually, to me of some of the stuff that I've seen in Northern Ireland. But there was tremendous international criticism of Israel during this time. And there were massively disproportionate casualties. About 1,000, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 Palestinians were killed versus about 180 to 200 Israelis, although it's extremely important to note, and this is very much part of kind of the reality of Palestinian politics, that about 1,000 more Palestinians were actually killed during the Intifada in intra-Palestinian factional violence. So we're talking about things like the summary execution of suspected informants, again, very reminiscent of Northern Ireland. And so we have to remember that these were extremist groups, right? For the most part, these were extremist groups, not functioning political parties as we understand them. And as the Intifada kind of descended and as the country kind of defended into confusion and factionalism, both sides realized that it couldn't continue. So this kind of took us to 1992 and 93, when Israeli and Palestinian negotiators met in Oslo, trying to hammer out the basis for some kind of rapprochement between the two states. And there were two important outcomes in Oslo, and one was that the PLO renounced terrorism. It moderated its political program, and Yasser Arafat essentially persuaded the Palestine National Council to recognize the state of Israel, to accept UN resolutions going back to 1947, and to adopt the two-state solution as official Palestinian policy. And so it renounced terrorism. It agreed to exert control over PLO elements that engaged in terrorism, and also declared that clauses in the PLO charter, like some of the ones that we just read, that denied Israel existence as a state and called for armed struggle, were now, quote, inoperative and no longer valid, unquote. And Israel, for its part, recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, quote unquote, and as a negotiating partner within the context of the Middle East peace process. And this led to a creation of a body, the Palestinian interim, and here's Bill Clinton, smiling Bill with Arafat and Tzach, and it created the Palestinian Interim Self-Government Authority, which was an elected council that would govern Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And this, of course, would eventually become the Palestinian Authority, or PA, which is the governing body of the West Bank, but not Gaza. Okay, so, well, it's kind of sort of, but not Gaza. And it also resulted in the designation of areas within the West Bank that would remain under Israeli control, and those that would be de facto governed by the Palestinian Authority. Okay, so areas A, B, and C. So area A, which you can see here, are Palestinian cities. Those are the dark spots on the map of the West Bank. They're under total Palestinian control. Palestinian towns and villages, those are the gray areas that are under Palestinian civil control, and area C is under total Israeli control, and which is administered largely by the IDF. So in some ways, the Oslo Accords were remarkable, and it's a fascinating process and deserves, in some ways, an entire course of its own. But it demonstrated a genuine level of good faith on both sides, and may have been the closest that we ever got to a two-state solution. And in some ways, this map could have been the beginning of a two-state solution. And Prime Minister Rabin, who was a war hero, senior general in the IDF, former defense minister, kind of emerged as the face of the peace camp. And also, interestingly, it was one of the few times in history that a committed terrorist group, the PLO, Fatah, sort of managed to transform itself or transition itself into at least the beginnings of the sphere of legitimate politics. And it's one of the few places, and you know, it's very, very rare. And one of the few other places that it's happened was Colombia, when back in the 1970s and the 1980s, a terrorist group known as the M19 actually became a legitimate political party and still sends members to the Colombian Congress and Senate. But the law of unintended consequences always prevails, right? And many Palestinians, egged on by extremists, often saw the accords as a compromise by Yasser Arafat and the PLO that was aimed purely at hanging on to power. They didn't believe that Israel had any intention of allowing the formation of a Palestinian state, short or long term, and pointed to what one Palestinian negotiator called the terrible asymmetry in power and force between the two parties. And on the Israeli side, influential ultra-Orthodox rabbis, much of the settler movement denounced, and the settler movement was a movement by then, denounced Rabin and his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, as traitors and criminals. Tension ratcheted up, beginning in February 1994, February 94, an American Baruch Goldstein, militant American settler, follower of an ultra-right rabbi, killed Meir Kahane, killed 29 Arabs at worship in the Mosque of Abraham, Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, in turn giving rise to an escalating series of terrorist attacks by Palestinians and by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad over the ensuing 2 years. And this, of course, led to one of the most traumatic events in modern Israeli history, at least up until that point, which was the November 1995, assassination I think the screen likes to freeze, of Prime Minister Rabin, not by a Palestinian, but by a Jewish ultranationalist who believed that Rabin had sold the country out with the Oslo Accords. And this is he just finished singing at a rally in Tel Aviv, the Shir LaShalom, popular Israeli song, and had sort of tucked the lyrics into the pocket of his suit coat, and that's stained. That's his copy of the lyrics, stained with his blood. So the aftermath of this, well, the transition from sort of PLO to Palestinian Authority continued, and Palestinian jurisdiction over parts of the West Bank particularly continued. Negotiations around the specificities of Oslo started to break down. And some of the really problematic points include the status of Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, long since annexed by Israel. And because, of course, Jerusalem, known as Al-Quds in Arabic, is also claimed as the capital of a Palestinian state. And neither side is prepared to move on. The other huge sticking point, of course, is the law of return, because Palestinians, one of their negotiating positions, especially in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, and continues to be a negotiating position, is an analog of the Israeli law of return, which of course applies to any Jew anywhere in the world. And so the obvious problem with this, from an Israeli standpoint, is the near certainty, if Palestinians begin taking advantage of a law of return of their own, which wouldn't just apply to the West Bank and Gaza, but would apply to Israel proper, is that it would lead to the eventual emergence of an Arab majority in the state of Israel. And then, of course, would Israel be a Jewish state at that point? And both David Ben-Gurion and Ariel Sharon have, in their own way, made the point that Israel can be a Jewish state, it can be a democracy, and it can be a state that extends to the boundaries of historical Israel, but it can't be all three. Pick two. And the problem of this Arab majority is, I think, one of the reasons why Israel, aside from inheriting a whole lot of trouble, is not prepared to annex the West Bank wholesale into greater Israel. So as Oslo broke down, the situation started to default to pre-accord levels. And one of these was, God, why is it doing that? Sorry, guys. Here we go. There we go. That's what you see. This would be, as it broke down, by 2000, we had the beginning of the second intifada, which was a whole other kind of situation compared to the first intifada. It involved serious terrorist attacks, often carried out by emerging groups like Hamas, like the Lebanon-based Hezbollah, and they resumed both in frequency and intensity, and inevitably provoking a response from the IDF, from the Israeli police. And so one of the results of this was kind of the collapse of what had been the final collapse, because it had really been collapsing for a long time, of that old kind of Israeli political establishment of left-wing progressive, the secular labor coalition, and so on, and the rise of much more hard right groups. And also, perhaps just as importantly, was the increasing alienation in relationships between Israelis and Palestinians, and culminating in the erection, the construction of the so-called security barriers between Israel and the West Bank and Jerusalem, and strict controls on Palestinian entry into Israel proper. So until Oslo, and I kind of want to emphasize this, and I base this, partly on sort of reading and talking, but partly on observed and lived experience. Until Oslo, Israelis and Palestinian Arabs kind of knew each other. And again, I know I said this before, but I want to emphasize that they knew each other. People on the street worked together, they socialized together. There was a sense, however limited, that there was some kind of a bond that came from shared existence, and that somehow we're all in this together. And the security barriers worked. Security barriers were very effective. But by the first decade of this century, of the new century, they effectively destroyed any real sense of a kind of a bicultural existence. And so increasingly, Israelis and Palestinians were two tribes, but even Jewish and Arab Israeli citizens of the same state were increasingly isolated from each other. And this, of course, was accompanied by a massive acceleration of the settler enterprise in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, as it is often known, which was accompanied by a total pullout of settlers and Israeli governance and security structures from Gaza in 2005. And many of those settlers immediately went over to the other side and founded settlements in the West Bank. Now, I want to kind of talk about Hamas, because I think that it's important to understand a little bit more about Hamas, of course, given what's going on currently, and what we've all been living with for the past, how many months is it now? October, 5 months. So in 2006, Palestinian Authority, last time, held elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council. And Hamas, which kind of counterintuitively campaign, or not for Hamas, but sort of from the perspective of this kind of post-Oslo Palestinian Authority, campaigned on a platform of armed resistance to Israel. And it won by a significant majority. And it was followed, of course, by the PLO's successor Fatah as a kind of and which of course says it remains committed to the two-state solution, if that's even viable anymore. So the most militant faction of Hamas withdrew to Gaza, where it governs, and Fatah remains the government in the West Bank, which is in control of the Palestinian Authority. And so in these elections of 2006, these internationally supervised democratic elections in the West Bank and Gaza, supervised by Elections Canada, among others, saw Fatah Party confirmed as the nominal governing body of the occupied West Bank. And in Gaza, voters rejected Fatah, presided over by Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, and which is widely regarded as corrupt and sclerotic, and elected Hamas by by a margin of 76 out of 132 seats. Now, there's a lot that I haven't covered, but I think the final part of this is another digression. So Hamas is an acronym, and it's an acronym for, we got to work on this computer of yours, Yaakov. Here we go. I need training. Yeah, I do need training. Sorry about that. So Hamas is an acronym for an Arabic term meaning Islamic resistance movement. And it's also an Arabic word that conveys the sense of strength or bravery. And most of us know that in Hebrew, the word Hamas is a term that appears in the Bible for violence.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
And it's violent robbery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that Hamas is a brutal terrorist group. Just going to get this cord out. Is supported both by years of rigorous intelligence collection and analysis and by a meaningful international consensus. It's a listed terrorist group in Canada and the United States, most of our allies, and this automatically makes it a counterterrorism and a national security priority of the first rank. So the Hamas Charter of 1988 refers specifically to the obliteration of Israel as its primary mission. And it's interesting that Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, in all of their kind of foundational documents, make constant reference to an infamous Islamic hadith, or a teaching of the Prophet, which is distinct from and dated after the Quran, that relates how on the day of judgment, the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "Oh, Muslims, there's a Jew behind me. Come and kill him." It goes on. The Nazism of the Jews does not skip women and children. It scares everyone. They make war against people's livelihood. They plunder their money and threaten their honor. For Zionist scheming has no end. And after Palestine, they will covet expansion from the Nile to the Euphrates. Their scheme has been laid out in the protocols of the elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what is said there. So in this context, violence against Israeli civilians, specifically Jews, is fully justified. Not just in the context of putatively illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank, but in the entirety of the state of Israel and in Jewish interests abroad. Now, Hamas is a really interesting hybrid of two strains of extremism. In its more public face, its reasonable face, as it were, it purports to be a Palestinian nationalist movement with very specific views regarding the replacement of an illegal settler enterprise with a Palestinian state. And so this eliminationism lies at the heart of Hamas ideology and intentionality, and is embodied, of course, in the very well-known River to the Sea slogan, which has been taken up by all kinds of progressive people, including in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. And most of the people who kind of parrot it probably couldn't actually name either the river or the sea. I mean, it's probably the La Have River and, minus Basin or something like that. So anyway, But what's important is that the idea of Palestinian indigeneity is less important to Hamas than its rootedness in Islamist principles. And that means that its political ideology, aside from sort of all of the gloss around River to the Sea, gloss around the protocols of the elders of Zion, the Nazism of the Jews, and so on, its political ideology derives purely from the Quran and from the teachings of the Prophet. And this explains language in the Hamas charter, like we will raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. The land of Palestine has been an Islamic waqf, and a property that's held in trust throughout the generations, and until the resurrection, no one can renounce it or abandon it. So in its contemporary manifestation, Islamism is a 20th century post-war ideology. It's a response to political repression in the Islamic world, the repression of Muslims by Muslims. It's a response to Western expansionism, and it's a response to the perceived decadence inherent in secularism. One of the founders, one of the primary sort of intellectual engines driving contemporary Islamism is a man named, an Egyptian academic, thinker, writer named Said Qutb. And he kind of developed a lot of his theories while he was a graduate student in the United States, and was horrified by what he saw, from what he called jazz dancing to, women making themselves, into objects of lust and desire, et cetera, et cetera. So pure Islamism is both apocalyptic and fundamentalist in its worldview. And critically, it reframes the Islamic concept of jihad, which embodies both physical and spiritual struggle, into a purely offensive concept directed against both the West and also critically against those Muslims who do not adhere to the retrograde and reductionist Islamist worldview, which explains why there are so many more Muslim victims of groups like Hamas and ISIS and Al-Qaeda than there are non-Muslim victims. So in this way, Hamas is very much part of the kind of the jihadi or Islamist extremist tendency that includes ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And its goals are less about Palestinian liberation than they are about a much wider political movement that would see the recreation of the Islamic world as a unified Islamic caliphate. And we haven't really talked that much about Hezbollah, but Hamas is interesting because it's a Sunni Islamic Islamist organization, as are Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It is also an Iranian client, which is a Shia state. And it's part of the larger Iranian strategy to kind of destabilize Israel and the Levant in its bid to become the power broker of the Middle East, and part of its sort of Iranian grand strategy, as it were. But, and again, unlike Hezbollah, it's not a Shia organization, so its relationship with Iran is complicated. But Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a Salafist Islamist secret society that is dedicated to the return of first principles, including the reestablishment of a caliphate across the Middle East. And that's why in the end, Hamas is actually pretty much disinterested in the actual plight of Palestinians than it is in advancing its own Islamist and jihadist agenda. But it also knows how to play the game. Hamas is very clever. It's a very clever organization. Not only does it govern Gaza, for better or for worse, but its enforcement of Sharia law, unlike ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda, can be very selective. And so while while Amnesty International, among other groups, gives Hamas abysmal marks for its record on basic human rights, it displays a degree of tolerance, albeit limited, for the small community of Christians that remains in Gaza, as well as for some forms of dress and behavior that don't conform to strictly Islamist norms. You will not see a whole lot of women in Gaza wearing burqas. So Hamas's Islamist rigor can be as elastic as expediency requires it to be. And I think that's what makes it such a challenging organization to kind of grab onto. And its apparently ability to focus on the here and now of the Palestinian liberation struggle, it was active in both intifadas, very active in the second intifada, also serves to give it legitimacy in the eyes of many Palestinian constituencies. And Israeli analysis of Palestinian polling data reported just about a month before October the 7th, found that 44% of Gaza residents support Hamas, even if that number is inflated due to fear of Hamas reprisal. Sorry, I'm behind on my there you go. It suggests that Hamas enjoyed, at least until October, a degree of popular support, and we just don't know where that stands now. We really don't. So there's no doubt that what happened on October the 7th, 2023, was a massacre of innocent civilians. And I don't know how many of you were present last week. I know that some of you were present at the movie about the massacre at the Supernova Music Festival, which was a very graphic depiction of what happened on October the 7th. So it was a massacre of innocent civilians. So an analogy with ISIS in particular, and certainly Israel has made this analogy, the United States has made this analogy. It's the analogy with ISIS is kind of apt because with this kind of historical glorification of what I call the pornography of violence, it's a very easy one to make and not, as I say, unreasonable. The problem is that the connection between Hamas and ISIS will end up linking not only Gazan civilians, I think, but the entire Palestinian cause, which is not entirely jihadist by any means, to a particularly horrifying and repellent kind of violence in there. We're all very familiar with those. And I'll just end with an etching from one of my favorite artists, Kata Kollwitz, who understands war and violence. And I think that over the long term, this linkage is going to serve to taint legitimate Palestinian aspirations, because there are legitimate Palestinian aspirations for normalization and statehood. It will taint them as fundamentally violent and extremist in nature. So unless we're very careful, the outcome of this war could be the perpetuation of the cycle of despair in the region, and believe me, nobody benefits from that. And the other problem, from my perspective, is that extremism, once it takes root, abhors a vacuum. And if Hamas is truly wiped out, with all that implies in terms of collateral destruction, who or what will arise to fulfill that abhorrent vacuum? So the invocation of ISIS in the context of this war may unfortunately become a self-fulfilling prophecy, perhaps not in the form of ISIS itself, which is engaged in itself enjoying a little bit of a resurgence, but in something very much like ISIS, or perhaps even worse than ISIS. So that's our course. Thank you. We finished right on time, even with technical difficulties. Now I'm gonna take a few questions, but I also I'm sorry, I'm very aware. Oh, sorry. I'm very aware of how bad the fog is out there, and so I'm a little bit worried about driving home, but I have to drive
stay here all night.
We could stay all night, but if people do have questions, I would, by all means, send them to the rabbi or to Marty. Some of you actually have my email address. If you don't, send them to the Marty or rabbi, and the Marty. That's what I'm going to call you from now on, the Marty. And they'll just pass them on to me, and then I'll just reply to you directly. Okay, but Yeah, but I'm here for a few more minutes, so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A question from the Zoom call?
Done?
All right, thank you very much. And yes, we're going to stop the share and the recording. And again, if anyone has any questions, you could also email me and I could direct you to Angus, his email, and I'll be able to answer questions. Yeah,
Just
sorry.
wondering,